And one of the world's largest oil companies has just ditched the dollar, opting instead for the euro. Russia's Rosneft has switched its contract currency of choice in lieu of U.S. sanctions. So for more details, let's turn to investigative journalist Ben Swann. So Ben, give us a summary of what Rosneft just did and why.
Yeah, I think essentially what Rosneft just did was they decided that they were no longer going to accept the dollar as the currency of choice, and they're looking to essentially sell oil using euros and rubles in order to get around U.S. sanctions. I don't think it's necessarily very surprising that this step has been taken by this company, specifically because we know that there have been efforts made in the past by other nations and other oil companies to try to move away from the petrodollars as we would know it, right? The U.S. dollar that is backed by oil, which has been that way since 1973, when essentially the U.S. and Saudi Arabia made a deal for all oil to be sold in U.S. dollars. And so we've seen this attempt made in the past, but this is a significant one because Rosneft is really the largest oil company so far to take this step.
So, Ben, we know that the U.S. sanctions on Rosneft, they stem from them doing business with Venezuela. Do you think the U.S. is using political means to shape global capitalism?
Well, global capitalism, but also just the global landscape. The U.S. has done this for decades, many decades, where it attempts to influence multinational corporations and governments by saying, well, we have sanctions here, and therefore we can punish a country like Venezuela by not allowing Venezuela to sell its crude oil or to sell its oil exports. And we've seen this issue going on now for the past few months, specifically with Rosneft and Venezuela, because the U.S. has already put sanctions on that oil and then put sanctions on the crude oil that is essentially the least refined and the messiest, and they went after that as well. And so the U.S. has gone consistently after Venezuela, and they're trying to prevent any kind of relationship between Venezuela and other nations or private companies in order to prevent the Venezuelans from getting a foothold, because that's where the majority of their money comes from. The majority of the nation's economy is based upon oil, as you know, Manila. And so this has been going on for some time. And so now what we see happening with Rosneft is they're saying, well, here's a way that we can get around those U.S. sanctions.
And now, Ben, you touched on this a moment ago. A lot of big businesses abroad have followed suit, not only Russia. A lot of companies are ditching the dollar. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's an intentional effort that's been made by certain nations, specifically BRICS nations. So Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa. Those 5 nations as BRICS nations have made a concerted effort where they can to move away from the U.S. dollar. Because they don't like the fact that the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, and they certainly don't like the fact that the U.S. dollar is used as a hammer when it comes to sanctions to punish countries and to control global outcomes. So the Chinese have already attempted to do this. The Russians attempted to do it. Iran's attempted to do it. India's attempting to do it. It's happening on multiple fronts simultaneously. And I truly believe, I've said this before, Manila, this is probably one of the least talked about and yet most important issues of our time. Certainly for Americans and for the next generation of Americans coming along, that there are nations that are working very hard to dislodge the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency because of the way the U.S. has used it to hammer nations in the past. And I think that there will ultimately be a reckoning for having used the U.S. dollar to batter other nations, because eventually we're going to lose that world reserve currency status.
Yeah, it does seem like we have kind of weaponized the U.S. dollar.
Absolutely.
Last thing here, Ben. Do you think it gets a little bit muddier, specifically with Rosneft, separating business from politics, given that Rosneft is state-controlled?
Well, I don't know that it gets necessarily muddier. It plays into the reality, right, which is that this goes beyond just the action of one company. It certainly is, I believe, the effort and the intention of the Russian government to weaken the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, as it is the Chinese government, as it is the Indian government, as it is the South African government. Those attempts have been made for some time. So yeah, it muddies the water just a little bit, but I just think it's par for the course, because if we look at this one isolated story and you say, yeah, it's one story, yeah. The U.S. still has oil being sold in dollars for about 90% of the entire world market. So it's not that big of a deal for one story and one particular instance. But when we see it playing out in multiple avenues, in multiple fields across multiple nations, That's where it makes a difference.
Yeah, we're obviously seeing a trend. I mean, I really thought, Ben, that you were going to drift into the world of the U.S. dollar being fiat, not being tied to anything. Other people's money is backed by something. And I mean, I don't know.
Well, remember this too, just real quick, that the U.S. dollar is backed by something more than anything else. It's the petrodollar. We've been backed by oil. So where it has a real significance in harming the U.S. is that is what has actually stabilized. Oil prices have stabilized the dollar more than any other force since 1973. You take that away, you weaken it.
That is true. All right, my friend, I'm out of time. We'll leave it right there. Ben Swann, always appreciate your take. Thank you.
Manila, thanks.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.